It is highly unlikely that Saudi soldiers will be sent to Pakistan in case of a war with anyone and die for Pakistan. Is India going to share nuclear technology with the Emirates? Is India going to send soldiers to defend the UAE? The US under Trump is highly unpredictable. The UAE does have a military, does have a strong military, battle tested.
After Donald Trump has come to the White House, they are slowly pulling away from the region.
Yes, I think Somaliland has a long history, right? The separatist movement in Somaliland goes beyond all of this.
Welcome to F4 Talks. With me is Fernando Carvajal, an expert on Middle Eastern affairs and a walking encyclopedia on Yemen. Fernando, let's dive right in. Can you tell our viewers what is going on in Yemen? Why are Saudi Arabia and the UAE furious with each other?
Thank you, Rohan, once again for having me. Appreciate your time and the invitation. This is definitely some of that unexpected developments in Yemen, where literally a month ago, everyone was thinking the conflict was going on a different direction, where the SDC, the Southern Transitional Council, was consolidating their control, their power, their influence across the southern provinces. Let's keep in mind that the coalition that was formed in March 2015 at the behest of then President Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi has been led by Saudi Arabia, right? The now hegemon in not just in the peninsula, but let's say the Arab world, right? Under the auspices of the Arab League. And with this coalition, it was everyone from the GCC except Oman. Oman was the only one that stayed out of this coalition, but it also included Jordan, Sudan, and Egypt. And so at the beginning of the conflict of the civil war, the current civil war 10 years ago in March 2015, Saudi Arabia divided sort of Yemen into three spheres. The north for Saudi Arabia, Ma'arib for Qatar and Saudi, and then the south was basically handed over to the Emirates because of their historical connections with the Emirates, specifically with Jaffa tribes. And this is relevant later on when we do some editing and editorials, because now this area controls Aden, basically, as a result of the events. And so for 10 years, Saudi and the Emirates had cooperated in what we refer to as the liberated provinces, the 8 provinces of the south. This is the old South Yemen, the old People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. And naturally, what became the Southern Transitional Council was allied with the UAE and financially and politically fed by Abu Dhabi. And we saw a continuation of stability from July 2015, when the Houthis were expelled from the south, to recently in December. An evolution of stability, stabilizing the chaos, not really resolving the conflict. What we saw in December was, in my regard, a complete miscalculation by multiple parties. Definitely what began as a small conflict over an ambitious deputy governor of Hadramaut, bin Habrish, who took over a government oil facility in Hadramaut, and pro-SDC UAE supported forces countered this incursion, this aggression into Petromasila, to liberate from the deputy governor's forces, allied forces. This was simply a conflict over access to resources. But soon enough, unfortunately, or as expected, the southern forces advanced against rival military forces, which were under the legitimate government, which is supported by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, interesting enough, Saudi Arabia within days, I believe it was 3 or 4 days of the SDC forces advancing along the Rub al Khali, the empty quarter, which shares a border with Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Hadramaut, issued a statement saying that instability along its border was a national security threat. And then this led to them mobilizing new military forces that the Saudis had trained, called the National Shield Forces, into northern Hadramaut and Mahra, which borders Oman. And this is where the escalation begins with STC forces. This is where sort of it was painted as a proxy war between Saudi and the Emirates at the beginning, but
Right.
really it was a natural consequence of events in Hadramaut when two rival factions competed for territory, for influence. What I like to do is I like to compare what happened in December 2025 to what was going on in October 2019. In October 2019, the same SDC forces expelled the military forces allied with the former President Hadi and allied with the Sunni Islamist party Al-Islam, Muslim Brotherhood wing, and expelled them from Aden, from the capital, with assistance from the UAE, with military assistance with the UAE. At that time in 2019, Saudi Arabia did not intervene militarily in support of the legitimate government against the southern forces. They allowed things to develop, events to evolve, and then they called in a dialogue in Riyadh in November, which then became the Riyadh Agreement, which unified all factions under a government. Now compare it to what happened in December. In December, a lot of people are saying, well, why didn't the STC attack the Saudis? Why didn't the Emiratis come to the rescue, basically, and help their allies or their clients militarily? This is, you know, this is basic tribalism in a way, in the way that these societies still function under that context. And there was no way that the Emirates were going to engage directly with the Saudis militarily, or were even going to create the optics of supporting a party against the Saudis directly, which would have been the Southern forces.
Right.
Because the Saudis didn't do it in 2019. And the GCC is inseparable, indivisible, right? Not just politically and historically, but geographically. And what we're seeing is sort of a different manifestation of what we saw in 2017, 2018 of the conflict with Qatar,
Right.
which is also another political spat, diplomatic spat. So to wrap it up on this area, the tensions go beyond Yemen, and we saw how a miscalculation by the southern forces, perhaps a miscalculation by the Saudis, has led to a major conflict that now has taken a life of its own on media, on mainstream media and social media.
Right, right. Fernando, I want to go beyond what you just said, that it's now beyond Yemen, and I want to bring in two countries here. We spoke the last time we spoke. We extensively discussed Sudan, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia are both heavily involved in Sudan. But now it's also about Somalia and Somaliland. Can you tell us how these two countries are now shaping up to be a battle between, or somewhat of a battle between the Emiratis and the Saudis?
Yes, I think Somaliland has a long history, right? The separatist movement in Somaliland goes beyond all of this, and is just simply, looking for allies, looking for diplomatic support, looking for financial support. For me, the main interesting point is Sudan, because
Right.
this is an evolving crisis, conflict. And you're right, Sudan is very relevant because just in November, when Mohammed bin Salman, when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia visited Washington and met with President Trump, there was a deal made where the U.S. delegated the peace efforts in Sudan to the Saudis.
Right.
And in late November, Saudi Arabia was really engaging a peace process. They were meeting with Burhan, who is the de facto leader of the Transitional Council in Port Sudan, the commander of the Sudanese Armed Forces, and really tried to convince Burhan to join peace talks under the Quad, the Quad, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Egypt, and the U.S. And Burhan rejected that initial idea, which was a U.S. proposal. What we've seen over the last 4 weeks, literally the last 4 weeks, the end of December to now, is Saudi Arabia really taking on a different role simply because the U.S. is so hands off. The U.S. engagement in Sudan is now only through its special envoy, and he is opposed by Burhan and SAF, and really tries to stay away from relations with the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan. And so now Saudi Arabia, because of this conflict with the UAE in Yemen, has taken on a different role in Sudan. Number one, interesting enough, and I don't think anybody else really in mainstream media are paying attention, is Saudi Arabia has really marginalized Iran. If you remember the last time we spoke about Sudan, I talked about how engaged Sudan was with the SAF, with military, providing military equipment, the presence in Port Sudan. And if we look at the last 3 weeks, Iran has really taken a back seat in Sudan, where Saudi Arabia has been very much at the forefront, to the point where just this past weekend, Saudi Arabia announced that it will buy all of Sudan's gold, right? Meaning all of SAF provided gold, because this is their primary source of funding.
Right.
And so this is a major role. I mean, Saudi Arabia was delegated a role of negotiator, of mediator, but now Saudi Arabia is engaging itself directly into the conflict, providing funding for SAF, right? And so this is definitely something that we can say is directly countering Emirati role in East Africa, for example. Let's also remember, we talked about this, SAF signed a military agreement with Pakistan, where Pakistan pledged to provide over $1 billion worth of weapons to Burhan and his forces. We didn't know where the funding was coming for such a purchase, but it's slowly coming out, right? And so this goes directly to now the Pakistan, Saudi, Turkey alliance, defense pact. We know Turkey is highly involved, is deeply involved in Sudan. And so we are starting to see what the spat that began in Yemen, we're definitely starting to see it evolve and cross over conflict lines elsewhere beyond the peninsula.
Right. Well, Fernando, you raised two really important points, and I would say those are your insights. The first is that the US is playing a lesser role in the region. They have, after Donald Trump has come to the White House, they are slowly pulling away from the region. And I think Saudi Arabia is taking a more proactive role with the vacuum that the US is leaving, and it's clearly visible with the moves that they're making. And I want you to talk a little bit more about their strategic defense agreement with Pakistan. It was signed in September 2025. We don't know all the details yet, but what we know is that they've declared that an attack on one will be seen as like an attack on the other. It's a very NATO-styled defense agreement. And now you've got Turkey wanting to join this pact. Why Turkey? How come Turkey is interested in signing a deal with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan?
Well, it is highly unlikely that Saudi soldiers will be sent to Pakistan in case of a war with anyone and die for Pakistan. It is highly unlikely that Turkish soldiers will be sent to Saudi Arabia or Pakistan to die for somebody else's war, right? So this is diplomacy. This is, geopolitics here, where we look at the map and we see Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, right? And then we also see how engaged Saudi Arabia is in Syria, which is Turkey's priority at the moment, right? the let's remember, obviously we've been reminded over the last 2-3 weeks that Saudi Arabia was one of the main funders, founding sources for Pakistan's nuclear program when it began. And so it wasn't the only, but it was one of the parties that helped fund the nuclear program. So we can see the history of this, and we can see the national interest of Saudi Arabia, right,
Yeah.
in partnering with a nuclear power. Now, all of this, as I mentioned, is definitely due to the U.S. weakness in the region, to the falling back. Keep in mind, Saudi Arabia has been begging, literally, the U.S. since the Biden administration for a defense pact, and the U.S. has fallen short of those expectations, especially because of the relationship with Qatar, for example, right? That
Right.
hosts a major naval base for the U.S. and an air base, which was attacked by the Iranians last year. So we can see how Saudi Arabia, short of going nuclear themselves, because they haven't finalized the deal for nuclear energy at the moment, how short of this pact with the US are reaching out diplomatically for a pact that grants them the optic of going nuclear, right? Because Iran across the Gulf is threatening to go nuclear overtly, right? And so this aims to give Saudi Arabia the status and the defense assurances that it needs in order to exert itself as a hegemon in the region, right? Let's keep in mind also that the UAE has also been trying to engage nuclear energy, nuclear power for its grid, and so this kind of alliance, I mean, hate to beat a cliche, but another crescent in the region, right, from Turkey to Saudi, Turkey, Syria, Saudi, Pakistan, is definitely a major symptom of the weak presence, engagement by the U.S., which is now perceived by partners and allies as not being an honest guarantor of safety in the region against their own rivals.
Mm.
And at the moment, again, partners within the GCC are not threats to each other, but they are neighbors who continue to threaten the peninsula. In our last episode, in our last conversation, I mentioned how Iran has encircled Saudi Arabia, right?
Right. Yeah. Yes.
Iran in the east, the Houthis in the south, Iran in Sudan, and the Iraqi militias in the north. And so definitely Saudi Arabia recognizes this threat, and it aims at more than just the optics of safety and national security with this pact.
Right. Well, an interesting development that has come out of the Saudi moves has been the way UAE has not only countered it, or maybe we can call it countered or not countered. We can discuss about that. But the kind of moves that they have made, especially when it comes to India, the country where I'm interviewing you from, very recently this week, UAE's president, along with his full cabinet, came to India for just 2 hours. And they've announced negotiations for a defense agreement. They've announced negotiations for a nuclear sharing agreement. Do you think this has some connection to the Saudi Pakistan deal?
I mean, another nuclear power, right?
Mm.
India is a balancing nuclear power, but again, is India going to share nuclear technology with the Emirates? Is India going to send soldiers to defend the UAE? The UAE does have a strong military, battle tested, because obviously they were engaged in Yemen for a number of years, right? Uh, this pact is definitely showing the flag. What we like to say, show the flag is like you go to somewhere else and you plant your flag because now you have relations with that state, in that territory. But definitely there are business interests between the
Mhm.
two. Again, now that the U.S. has laid out all the tariffs against India, right?
Right.
And they continue. And so this is definitely a business opportunity for the Emirates and for India with the investment needed for many projects in India. Um, it could be because we expect an eventual reconciliation between Saudi and India. We could expect the GCC to then move into playing a role as mediator and peace negotiator, right,
Mm,
between India and Pakistan as
mm,
well. I mean, if we look the positive side of these unilateral moves, right, quote unquote, uncoordinated as we see them from outside, just like Saudi Arabia and Qatar reconciliated, we can expect Saudi and the Emirates to reconcile soon
mm.
and de-escalate and once again engage in the normal politics. This could be the role played now by the GCC beyond the peninsula, where they could play a role as peacemakers in the subcontinent and benefit both parties. Let's remember that the GCC relies heavily on expat labor force from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan,
Yeah.
right? And so I personally, from my analysis, the way I look at it, I don't see it as an expansion of the rivalry. I want to see the positive that could come in 2 years, 3 years,
Mhm.
and definitely where Saudi and the Emirates, as co-hegemons, really could play a major role, could bring in the GCC to play a major role in the region as peace negotiators in something in a conflict area like Pakistan, India, which
Yeah.
benefits the GCC as a whole.
Right. So is that what you're seeing down the line? Maybe in a year or so. Do you think the UAE and Saudi Arabia are gonna sit together on the table and talk, or do you think the rivalry is going to deepen further?
Again, the GCC is indivisible geographically. To think of long-standing tensions between GCC members is really outside of our box, right?
Right.
And there are always rivalries between the three major GCC members: Qatar, Saudi, Emirates. There will always be rivalries, but I believe that we believe that their priority is the safety and security of the peninsula as a whole, right? And that they will, Saudi and the Emirates will eventually reconcile. The Yemen part, I think Sudan might take a little bit longer, whereas the Yemen part will be sooner, because it is so important to Saudi Arabia, which shares the one of the second longest border with Yemen. And now basically the Emirates are handing it all over to the Saudis and saying, okay, here, you want full responsibility for the whole of Yemen with the Houthis, with the South. It's all yours.
Mm.
Give it a shot. It's a huge challenge for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia really has an uphill battle here, policy, militarily, financially, and we have to see the next 3 to 6 months how Saudi Arabia responds to that. I believe that eventually the huge burden that is Yemen will have Saudi Arabia asking the Emirates to re-engage in a different format under a different context. But I believe Saudi Arabia will have to re-engage the Emirates.
Right. Well, Fernando, very quickly before we end this, we spoke repeatedly about how the US has pulled out of the region. Do you see China coming in and playing a much bigger role when it comes to not just the GCC, but handling what's going on right now between the UAE and Saudi Arabia?
I think it's too early for the GCC to commit to China
Hmm.
under the current circumstances in the US. It is very unpredictable. The US under Trump is highly unpredictable, and these monarchies then have to deal with the democratic process in the States, right? In the US or in the West. There's an election coming in November of this year for Congress.
Mhm.
If the Democrats win, that means tremendous pressure on the Trump administration, right? Handcuffing,
Right.
basically, lame duck for 2 years. If Trump finishes the 4 years, is he really going to run for a third term, for a second consecutive term? Or something happens and JD Vance becomes the front runner, et cetera, et cetera. So U.S. elections have always been very unpredictable for the Gulf monarchies. They are very engaged. They lobby as much as Israel does, but it's still very unpredictable for them. And I think that 2026 is going to be a wait and hold on the China relation until the Gulf sees the results of the midterm elections in November of this year. China will obviously, because of the sanctions, because of the decrease of commerce with the U.S., has to find new, bigger markets. The oil market continues to fluctuate. And the sale of weapons, again, because of this unpredictability. A couple of years ago, I made the comment that Saudi and the GCC could very easily shift to Chinese weapons, because you no longer really need jets when you have extremely effective, capable drones available that are cheap, that are produced cheaply by China. And for conflicts that the Saudis are dealing with, such as Yemen, that definitely becomes an alternative. So, in my opinion, that relationship with China is it would be on a wait and see mode this year. If things go the Republican way at the midterms, it's a whole different game, right? Because now Trump would be truly emboldened, will have a quote unquote, would claim to have a mandate, and the Saudis and the rest of the monarchies can approach Trump from a different position.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fernando, for speaking to Fair Observer and for sharing these brilliant insights. And I'll have to call you back again, maybe after the midterm, so we can understand what U.S. policy is going to be like in the Middle East.
For sure. Thank you so much, Rohan. Thanks to Fair Observer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.